A frigid Thursday night in late January. A lone man standing at a bus stop with his hands buried in his pockets. A patrol SUV slowing down for no reason anyone could explain. It happens across this country, more times than anyone wants to count. But this particular night, the officer behind the wheel picked the one man in the entire city he should never have touched. He thought he was bagging an anonymous nobody off the street. What he actually did was put his hands on one of the most dangerous litigators in the federal system. This is the story of a wrongful arrest, a ruined career, and an $11.3 million reckoning. Elijah Marsh did not look like a man who held real power. At 39, he was senior trial counsel in the Major Frauds and Public Corruption section at the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Ashford. That same afternoon, he had spent 6 straight hours in federal court picking apart a public bribery scheme that had quietly drained the city's transit authority for the better part of a decade. His questions were surgical. His pauses were calculated. When Elijah stood to address the bench, FBI agents in the gallery stopped scrolling their phones. When he raised an eyebrow at a witness, defense attorneys started whispering to their clients about plea deals. He was a man wrapped in the full, suffocating authority of the federal government. But the federal government couldn't jump a dead truck battery. Adnowa Chinchizhb. M. In the lower level of the parking structure beneath the Frederick T. Calloway United States Courthouse, Elijah turned the key in his black Ford F-150. And the engine answered with nothing but a flat, exhausted click. He sat there for a second, forehead nearly touching the steering wheel. It had been a brutal day. Cross-examinations, stacked on cross-examinations. One sidebar argument bleeding into the next. He was running on fumes. A tow would take an hour, maybe more, on a night this cold. So he decided to ride the bus partway home, instead of waiting around in a parking garage that smelled like motor oil and concrete dust. Before he'd left the office, Elijah had shed every piece of his courtroom armor. The charcoal suit, the burgundy silk tie, the crisp white shirt, all of it folded carefully into his canvas messenger bag. In their place, he pulled on a faded forest green pullover from his law school, Brennan University, a pair of olive joggers, and a rust-colored knit cap tugged low over his ears. He didn't look like the man who had just spent the day dismantling a bribery network. He looked like any other tired guy trying to get home before midnight. The wind coming off the Calder River was brutal that night, slicing sideways down the avenue. Elijah stood at a poorly lit bus shelter on the edge of Ridgeview, a neighborhood caught halfway between gentrification and decline. New coffee shops, 3 blocks one way. Boarded up storefronts, 3 blocks the other. The streetlights flickered. He checked his phone. The Route 8 bus was running 9 minutes behind schedule. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and rocked on his heels to stay warm. His breath fogging in front of his face. 4 blocks away, Officer Brett Calloway was nursing a half-finished energy drink and a bad mood. Calloway was 9 years into a career that had stalled out at patrolman. Weighed down by a quietly growing file of citizen complaints nobody above him had ever bothered to act on. He was bored, irritable, and itching for something, anything to put in his report that night. There had been a string of car break-ins around Ridgeview over the past 2 months, and dispatch had put out a description so vague it was practically useless. Male, black, roughly 6'3", dark winter clothing. On a night when half the city was wearing dark coats against the cold, that description fit thousands of men. Calloway wasn't interested in nuance. Though he wanted an arrest, his lieutenant couldn't complain about. He swung his SUV onto the avenue. The street was empty, except for a single figure standing under the bus shelter. Calloway's eyes narrowed. He eased off the gas, tires crunching over a patch of frozen slush, and studied the man tall, black, hood up, hands hidden, standing in shadow, To Elijah. The approaching headlights were just another car passing. Then the vehicle slowed to a crawl, and a spotlight snapped on, pinning him in a wall of white light. He squinted and raised a gloved hand against the glare. A patrol SUV. The engine idled with a low growl. Elijah felt a flash of irritation, but nothing close to fear. Why would he? He assumed this was routine. Maybe an officer asking if he'd seen anything unusual. The driver's door swung open. Calloway stepped out, one hand resting on his holstered sidearm. Boots, striking the icy pavement with deliberate weight. Step out of the shelter. Hands where I can see them. Calloway called, his voice already sharp with practiced authority. Elijah didn't move immediately. He was processing this was a Terry stop, an investigative detention. The Fourth Amendment required reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime had occurred, was occurring, or was about to occur. Standing at a bus stop did not meet that bar. Hands out of the pockets. No. Calloway barked. Closing the distance, Elijah slowly raised his palms, open and empty, and stepped forward into the spotlight. Officer, he said, calm and level. None of the panic Calloway expected to hear. I'm just waiting on the Route 8. It's running late. Is there a problem? I asked the questions. Calloway stopped about 4 feet away and clicked on a heavy flashlight, aiming it directly into Elijah's eyes, even though the spotlight already lit the whole shelter. What are you doing out here this late? I just told you. Waiting for a bus. A simmering frustration began building in Elijah's chest, though his voice stayed perfectly even. My truck died downtown. You live around here, Ridgeview. A few blocks up. Id. Calloway demanded. This was the hinge point, the moment that separated a citizen from a suspect. Elijah knew the state's stop and identify statute cold. It only applied if the officer had reasonable suspicion of a crime. He was a black man in a hoodie on a cold night. That wasn't reasonable suspicion. It was a description so broad it described half the city. But he also believed, fundamentally, in the system he'd spent his career defending. So he tried, one more time, to establish the legal baseline calmly. Before I reach for my ID, can you tell me what reasonable suspicion you have to detain me? Am I suspected of a specific crime? The question hung there in the cold. To Elijah, it was a routine procedural inquiry. To Calloway, it landed like an insult. His jaw tightened. In his experience, regular people on the street didn't talk like that. People who talked like that were either trying to start something or thought they were smarter than him. He hated both types equally. I don't need to give you a law lecture. Paul. Calloway stepped closer, into Elijah's space. The smell of stale cigarettes drifting off his jacket. We've had break-ins in this area. You match the description. Now you're either handing me ID, or I'm taking you in for obstruction. Your call. Match the description, the oldest, flimsiest justification in the book. A vague description didn't give an officer blanket permission to stop every man who shared a race and a height with a suspect, especially with no other suspicious behavior whatsoever. Elijah knew that if he were a white man in a wool coat standing at that same shelter, none of this would be happening. I understand you're doing your job. Officer, Elijah said, keeping every word measured, avoiding any sudden movement. But standing at a marked transit stop isn't suspicious activity. I'm declining to provide ID, as is my right under the Fourth Amendment. Am I free to go? Those 4 words, am I free to go, were the ones that mattered in a courtroom. They established, on the record, whether a person had been legally seized. Calloway's face went red. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered this calmly on a street corner. He was used to fear or attitude, things he knew how to handle with force. This cold, clinical defiance lit something ugly in him. You're not going anywhere. Without warning, he lunged, grabbing Elijah's upper arm in a bruising grip. "What are you doing? Don't touch me." "Stop resisting," Calloway shouted, a line rehearsed for the body camera and any potential witnesses. He spun Elijah around and slammed him chest first into the plexiglass wall of the shelter. The impact knocked the air out of him. His cheek pressed against the grimy, freezing glass. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the Route 8 finally rolling up to the curb. Brakes hissing, doors opening, and a handful of passengers staring out in stunned silence at a police officer pinning a man against the glass. "I am not resisting," Elijah said clearly, loud enough for any microphone nearby to catch. And then he went completely limp, offering zero physical resistance. He knew exactly how fast a wounded ego with a badge could turn a sidewalk into a crime scene. He'd fight this, but not here. He'd fight it in the arena he actually owned. Calloway kicked his legs apart and patted him down with unnecessary force. "Anything sharp on you, Needles. No weapons. You are making an unlawful arrest. I'm advising you to stop. Shut your mouth." The cuffs ratcheted tight around Elijah's wrists, biting into the skin. Elijah Marsh, the man who had personally signed off on wiretaps against organized crime figures, who had the direct line of a sitting federal judge, was now handcuffed like a vagrant outside a bus shelter. Calloway yanked the canvas bag off his shoulder and marched him toward the SUV. Wanted a law lecture. Here's a lesson in respect. He shoved Elijah into the back seat, slammed the door, and the cramped interior swallowed him in darkness that smelled like old vinyl and industrial cleaner. Through the wire mesh divider, Elijah watched Calloway walk to the driver's side, visibly pleased with himself. "Dispatch. Unit 9, Charlie. I've got one in custody at Halstead and 5th. Matches the description on the auto theft pattern. Uncooperative. Transporting to the 9th for booking. Toppy. 9, Charlie." Calloway glanced at the rearview mirror. "Smoke. Hope you didn't have big plans tonight." "Sean." Elijah held his gaze in the mirror. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. "Officer," he said softly, with the chilling calm of a man already 3 steps ahead. "You have no idea what you just did." Calloway laughed and threw the SUV into drive. The ride was a deliberate exercise in misery. Sharp turns meant to throw a handcuffed passenger across the slick seat. Elijah braced himself and said nothing, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of a complaint. Instead, his mind worked in the dark, cataloguing everything, the exact time, the cross streets, the badge number stitched above Calloway's pocket, the precise wording of every threat. By the time they reached the 9th District Station, Elijah had the bones of a federal civil rights suit assembled in his head. The booking area smelled like burnt coffee and despair. At the front desk sat Sergeant Walter Briggs, a tired man with maybe 4 years left until retirement, and absolutely no patience for paperwork tonight. "What we got?" Briggs asked without looking up. "Caught our auto theft guy near the transit stop on 5th. Calloway announced. "Matched the description. Refused ID. Got mouthy about constitutional rights. Writing him up for obstruction and resisting." Briggs finally looked up, taking in the knit cap, the pullover, the cuffs. "Put him on the wall. Empty his pockets." Calloway dumped the contents of the canvas bag onto the counter, the folded charcoal suit, the burgundy tie, legal pads dense with handwriting, and a thick leather bifold secured by a tarnished silver clasp. "Name?" Briggs asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Elijah said nothing. "Hey." Calloway smacked the back of his head, a casual, degrading little strike. "Sergeant asked you something." Elijah turned his head slowly and looked at Calloway, and something in his eyes made the officer take an involuntary half-step back. "I am invoking my right to remain silent," Elijah told Briggs. "I will not answer questions. I want my phone call." Briggs Sile. Fine. Holding cell 7. Calloway hauled him down a green-tiled hallway. uncuffed him through the bars of cell 7, and slammed the iron door behind him. "Get comfortable. You're going to be here a while." Back at the desk, Briggs sorted irritably through the property. He logged the phone, the keys, set the folded suit aside, weird clothes for a car thief to be carrying, and finally popped the tarnished silver clasp on the bifold wallet. Looking for a license to properly identify their John Doe. There was no driver's license waiting behind that flap. There was a brushed steel shield, gleaming dull silver under the fluorescent lights. Stamped above it, in raised lettering, United States Department of Justice. Below the shield sat a photo ID, Elijah Marsh's stern. Professional headshot, and beneath that, bold black text, Assistant, United States Attorney. Senior Counsel. Major Frauds and Public Corruption Section. Briggs's face drained of color. His hands trembled as he stared at the wallet like it might detonate. Assistant United States Attorneys didn't just prosecute street crime, they prosecuted police departments. They opened civil rights investigations. They had the power to bring entire precincts to their knees. "Oh, God," Briggs whispered. He looked at the arrest report. Calloway was casually typing up at the next terminal matched description. Refused ID. Resisted arrest. A boilerplate justification. Every cop in the building had used 100 times. But this time it had been used on a man who literally argued cases like this one in federal court for a living. Calloway, Briggs shouted, knocking his chair into a filing cabinet as he stood. "Get over here right now." Calloway strolled out of the break room with a fresh energy drink in hand. "What's the problem?" Sarge guy still running his mouth. Briggs just pointed a shaking finger at the open wallet. Calloway walked over with a smirk that died the second he saw the shield. He looked at the photo, the name, the title, the federal seal. The can slipped from his hand, hissing as it hit the floor and spun across the linoleum. Foam pooling around his boots. "Tell me you didn't put hands on him," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Tell me he came in voluntarily." Calloway stared at the shield, his bravado crumbling in real time. I cuffed him. Sarge. Tossed him in the back. Told him to shut up." He remembered the shove into the glass, the slap to the back of the head. Briggs closed his eyes and pressed his fingers into his temples. "Get the captain. Wake him up. Call everyone." Should I go apologize, uncuff him? You don't go near that cell." Briggs snapped, fear curdling into fury. "You don't speak to him. You don't look at him. You just drop the entire weight of the federal government onto this department. You absolute, in holding cell 7. Elijah Marsh sat in the dark, listening to the chaos echo down the hallway. He leaned his head back against the cold concrete and allowed himself a small, grim smile. The trap had closed. Now the real work could begin. Captain Nathaniel Cross, 55 years old, and counting down the days to retirement on a quiet stretch of coastline, answered his bedside phone at 240 a.m. with the gruff irritation of a man used to drunk and disorderly calls. By 2:43 he was speeding down the empty interstate in an unmarked SUV, his heart hammering against his ribs. 25 minutes later, Cross burst through the doors of the 9th District Station into an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. Briggs was pacing behind the desk, sweating through his shirt. Calloway sat slumped in a metal folding chair, staring at the floor like he was trying to memorize the tile pattern. "Where is he?" Cross demanded, already knowing the broad strokes from the phone call. "Cell 7, Briggs said, hands shaking as he passed over the keys. "Hasn't said a word. Hasn't asked for a lawyer. Of course he hasn't asked for a lawyer." "You idiot," Cross hissed. "He is the lawyer." He turned on Calloway. "You don't move. You don't text your union rep. You don't call your wife. If I find out you so much as glanced at that body camera footage, I will end your career personally." Cross straightened his uniform and walked down the hallway. He stopped in front of cell 7. Elijah sat perfectly still on the metal bench, hands resting on his knees, and looked up with an expression carved from stone. "Mr. Marsh." Cross's voice strained with forced civility as he fumbled with the keys. "There has been a serious mistake here tonight. I'm Captain Nathaniel Cross. I'm opening this door, and you are free to go. With our sincerest apologies." The deadbolt clicked. The door swung open, screeching on its hinges. Elijah didn't move toward it. "Captain Cross," he said. "Are you unarresting me?" "Yes." "Sir, completely free to go. I'll have someone drive you anywhere you need." "Easy. And under what legal authority was I detained, transported, and locked in a cage tonight? It was an error." "Sir, on the officer's part, an error is a typo on a parking ticket." "Captain." Elijah's tone was chillingly polite, cutting like a scalpel. "What your officer committed was an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment, a deprivation of rights under color of law, under Title 18, Section 242, and felony battery. He detained me without reasonable suspicion, arrested me without probable cause, and assaulted me because I asked him to articulate his legal basis." Cross wiped sweat from his brow. "Please, let's step into my office. Get you some coffee. I'm not stepping into your office." "Captain." Elijah rose and walked into the corridor light, and Cross winced at the red welts ringing his wrists and a faint bruise blooming on his cheekbone. "I want my release processed properly. The booking sheet, the property receipt, the dispatch log from tonight's stop, and I want the badge number of the officer who assaulted me. I am not slipping quietly out a back door so this department can bury what happened." Cross knew he was cornered. 10 minutes later, Elijah stood at the booking desk, dressing himself with deliberate calm, the charcoal suit, the burgundy tie. The silver shield slipped back into the bifold, and the bifold back into the canvas bag. The transformation was striking. He went from suspect to a man who commanded rooms. He read every line of the documents Briggs handed over, trembling, before folding them into his breast pocket. Then he looked at Calloway, still slumped in the corner, pale and silent. "Officer," Elijah said, and the room went dead quiet. "I prosecute a lot of bad men in my line of work, but the ones who hide behind a badge to bully people on a public street, they're my personal favorites." He paused at the door. "Get yourself a very good lawyer." He walked out into the freezing dark without another word. By 8 the next morning, Elijah walked into the Frederick T. Calloway United States Courthouse, bypassed his own office entirely, and pushed through the heavy doors of the United States Attorney herself, Eleanor Voss. Voss, silver-haired and famous for her political ruthlessness, looked up from her morning briefing. Startled, "Elijah, you look like you got run over. What happened to your face, Eleanor?" "I need a leave of absence. Effective today." "A leave. We're impaneling the grand jury on the transit bribery case Thursday." "What is going on?" Elijah laid it out with the dispassionate precision of a man reading an autopsy report. The stop, the assault, the ride, the panic at booking. By the time he finished, Voss's face had gone a mottled red, her hand slamming flat on the desk. "They did what to a citizen? That's exactly the point. It just happened to be me. I'm calling the chief right now. I'll have that officer's badge by noon." "No," Elijah said firmly. "If you do that, it becomes a quiet political favor behind closed doors. The department learns nothing. The public sees nothing. And next month another man in a hoodie gets his face slammed into glass somewhere else in this city. So what's your move?" "I step back from federal duties to avoid any conflict of interest. I hire private counsel. And I sue the city, the department, and Officer Calloway for an amount so catastrophic they have no choice but to accept federal oversight of their entire patrol division. Voss leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Who are you hiring?" By that afternoon, Elijah sat in the glass-walled office of Victor Lansing, the most feared civil rights litigator on the East Coast, a man who had pried hundreds of millions of dollars out of corrupt municipalities and treated every press conference like opening night. They torched themselves on a biblical scale. Lansing said, "Pacing. We file under Section 1983 false arrest, excessive force, malicious prosecution, intentional infliction of emotional distress. I want the systemic rot exposed." Victor. Not just a check. He didn't even hesitate writing that report. Lansing said, "That means he's done this before, and somebody signed off on it every time. We're going to rip their internal affairs files wide open in discovery." The department wasn't going to fold quietly. Though, within 72 hours, anonymous leaks hit the local press, claiming Elijah had been acting erratically, that he'd matched a violent suspect's description, and that the force used was minimal and within policy. A predictable, convenient lie also surfaced. Calloway's body camera had malfunctioned in the cold. They had no idea Elijah was already 3 moves ahead. The morning after his release, he'd quietly had a process server deliver a preservation letter to the Ashford Regional Transit Authority. Nobody on that police force had remembered the bus. When the Route 8 had pulled up that night, its forward-facing security camera had captured the entire shelter in crisp, high-definition light, 10 days after the arrest. Victor Lansing stood on the plaza outside the Calloway courthouse, microphones bristling on the podium, every local news camera rolling. Elijah stood behind him in a pressed navy suit. "Face unreadable. 11 days ago." Lansing thundered. A federal prosecutor was treated like a dangerous animal for the crime of standing at a bus stop. For the last week, the police union has lied to this city. They said he was aggressive. They said the camera malfunctioned. They said the force was justified. He smiled, sharp as a blade. "We don't need their broken camera. We have the truth." The transit footage played on a screen beside the podium. No audio, just damning visuals. Elijah standing hands visible. Calloway, lunging. Unprovoked. The slam into the glass. Total compliance on one side. Total aggression on the other. Gasps rippled through the press corps. Camera shutters fired in a deafening burst. "Today," Lansing announced over the noise, "we are filing an $11.3 million civil rights lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Officer Brett Calloway. We are also formally petitioning the Department of Justice to investigate this department's pattern of racially biased policing." The trap hadn't just closed. It had snapped the department's credibility clean in half. 5 months after the arrest, the war moved into a sterile conference room at Lansing's downtown firm for depositions. Across the table sat Howard Pierce, the city's chief litigator, sharp, pragmatic, and visibly aware he was here to limit damage, not win. Beside him sat Brett Calloway, stripped of his badge and gun, placed on unpaid leave since the press conference, looking like he'd aged a decade in 5 months. He flinched every time Elijah's eyes drifted toward him. "State your name for the record." Lansing began. "Brett Andrew Calloway," he mumbled, for 3 grinding hours. Lansing walked him through his training, his career, and the night in question, boxing him in using nothing but his own sworn arrest report. "Officer Calloway, your report states you stopped Mr. Marsh because he matched the description of a suspect in a string of vehicle break-ins. Is that accurate?" "Yes." Dispatch put out a mail. "Black, dull, dark clothing, and you believed Mr. Marsh, standing at a brightly lit transit shelter, checking his phone, was fleeing the scene of a car break-in. I had reasonable suspicion to initiate the stop. Calloway recited, clearly coached. Lansing pulled a thick document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Exhibit C. Mr. Pierce. Pierce frowned, flipping it open. This, Lansing continued, is a certified transcript of the central dispatch log for the 9th District that night. Page 11. Timestamp, nu, 57 p.m. 8 minutes before you activated your lights and approached my client. Calloway's throat moved as he swallowed. Unit 9. Bravo apprehended the actual break-in suspect 3 blocks away. A 22-year-old male wearing a mustard-yellow parka and black jeans. Dispatch cleared the alert on your channel at 9:58 p.m. Pierce closed his eyes. You knew the suspect had already been caught. Lansing said, leaning in. You knew the alert was cleared. You had zero legal basis to stop my client. You didn't stop him because he matched a description. You stopped him because you wanted to harass a black man standing where he had every right to stand. I didn't hear the call. Radio was down. Your radio was down. Lansing produced another page. Then how did you acknowledge the status check on that same channel at 10:00 p.m.? I have the audio. Calloway's face went white. He glanced at Pierce for help. Pierce stared at the table. Let's talk about the body camera. Lansing said, relentless. You stated in your internal affairs interview that it malfunctioned in the cold. That's what happened. Tech fails. Elijah leaned forward for the first time, locking eyes with Calloway, who visibly shrank in his chair. We subpoenaed the metadata directly from Centurion Defense Technologies. Lansing said, Exhibit D. According to their internal audit, the unit didn't short out. It didn't lose battery. At Noah, p.m. and 45 seconds, 30 seconds before you stepped out of that SUV, the power button was held down manually for 3 full seconds until the camera shut off. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Spoliation of evidence. A federal crime. Not just a civil violation. You turned it off. Lansing said, no longer asking. Because you knew exactly what you were about to do. And you didn't want it on record. You just didn't count on a bus showing up on time. Objection. Pierce muttered weakly, knowing it meant nothing in a deposition. I'm finished, Lansing said, closing the folder. Mr. Pierce, I suggest a recess. As Lansing and Elijah stood to leave, Elijah paused at the door and looked back at Calloway, who was trembling. His career, freedom, and future reduced to ash in under an hour. I told you, Elijah said quietly. You had no idea what you'd done. 3 weeks after that deposition, Mayor Diane Castellano personally requested emergency mediation. The city was staring down a financial and political catastrophe if this went to a federal jury, with the dispatch logs, the body camera metadata, and the transit footage. The damages wouldn't stop at 11 million. A jury might award double that purely to punish the department. The mediation took place in a glass conference room overlooking the harbor. On one side sat Mayu Castellano, Police Chief Edgar Thatcher, and Howard Pierce. On the other, Elijah and Victor Lansing. Mr. Marsh. Mr. Lansing. Castellano said, exhausted. The city is prepared to admit fault. What happened was a disgrace. We're offering 2.8 million. Tax-free. Contingent on a standard non-disclosure agreement. We want to make this right. Lansing didn't even glance at his notes. He looked at Elijah. For the first time in the room, Elijah spoke. Mayor Castellano, let me explain your situation clearly. You are not buying my silence. I am a sworn officer of the United States Department of Justice. My obligation is to the law, not your municipal budget. He slid a single sheet across the table. These are my terms. There is no negotiation. First financial compensation will be $11.3 million. Not a dollar less. Second Officer Brett Calloway will be terminated immediately for cause, forfeiting his pension entirely. Third Captain Nathaniel Cross and Sergeant Walter Briggs will be forced into early retirement for failure of supervision and falsification of records. Fourth, if any of this is not met, I forward the unredacted discovery file to the Civil Rights Division of the FBI myself, and I will personally ensure they open a pattern or practice investigation into this department. You'll lose control of your hiring, your training, your budget. For the next decade. Chief Thatcher shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Marsh, we can't just dictate union pension terms unilaterally. I'd strongly suggest you figure it out. Chief. The silence stretched for 2 unbearable minutes. Mayor Castellano finally picked up a pen and signed, within 48 hours. The city announced the historic $11.3 million settlement publicly, with no NDA attached. Calloway was fired outright. 2 days later, he was indicted by a federal grand jury for deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of justice for tampering with the body camera. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial and received a 50-month sentence at a federal correctional facility, his badge, his freedom, and his pension all gone. Captain Cross and Sergeant Briggs quietly filed retirement paperwork and disappeared from public life. The 9th District was gutted and rebuilt from the command level down, staffed with reform-minded officers, terrified of the federal scrutiny now hanging over them. As for Elijah Marsh, the $11.3 million was wired into a trust. He donated $5 million to a legal defense fund, built to provide aggressive representation for people who'd been victims of police misconduct and couldn't afford lawyers like Victor Lansing. He kept the rest. 8 months after a dead truck battery rerouted the entire trajectory of his life, Elijah walked back through the doors of the Frederick T. Calloway United States Courthouse. He bypassed the administrative desk, took the elevator up, and sat down at his old desk. His charcoal suit fit exactly as it had before. The silver shield rested securely in his bag. He opened a fresh case file and picked up his pen. He was senior counsel in the Major Frauds and Public Corruption section, and he still had a great deal of work left to do. The story of Elijah Marsh is a sharp reminder of how quickly power curdles into abuse when officers believe nobody is watching. Brett Calloway thought he'd found an easy target, someone whose rights he could trample without consequence. He found out, far too late, that accountability sometimes comes from the one place you'd never expect it.